So one of the most powerful liberal charities in the world has been donating money to the Ku Klux Klan. Yep, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a left-wing agitprop organization that raises something like $100 million every year, has been handing money to white supremacists. Why in the world would they do that? And what the hell is going on? I will explain.
So Ben Shapiro just exposed the Southern Poverty Law Center, allegedly funding the very white supremacists they claim to fight. This isn't just hypocrisy, it's criminal fraud that funded Charlottesville while destroying conservative groups. We're covering how the racism industrial complex manufactured the crisis they profit from.
The demand for white supremacy on the left outstrips the supply. What do I mean by this? I mean that people on the left think, broadly speaking, that Americans are a set of horrible racists. And then they look around in the world, and it turns out that Americans are some of the least racist people in world history. Like, on the planet right now, Americans rank basically dead last in racism. If you go to any other country on planet Earth, what you will notice is that there is significantly more racism than there is in the United States. If you go to Japan, fair bit of racism in Japan. You go to South Korea, fair bit of racism in South Korea. You go to India, they've got some racism problems. You come to the United States, and the poll statistics suggest that, for example, the vast majority of Americans are fine with living next to people of different races. They are fine with intermarrying with people of other races. We have very high rates in the United States of ethnic intermarriage. Like, all of that with America, like, we are an extraordinarily tolerant and diverse people.
The data backs this up completely. World Values Survey shows Americans have the lowest racial bias globally. Under 5% express racial prejudice versus 15 to 40% in Europe and Asia. Yet progressives need systemic racism to justify their massive bureaucratic expansion and DEI spending.
But in order for the left to make its play for a sort of communitarian, centralized government, they have to constantly suggest that the government must be there in order to ram down the throats of those evil racists, who are the vast majority of Americans, according to the left. They have to ram down their throat decency and goodness. And the only way that you can sell that proposition is to create an ersatz, a false supply of racism. So this brings us to the Southern Poverty Law Center. So
this connects to the entire progressive apparatus. If America isn't systemically racist, then DEI departments, hate crime legislation, and racial equity programs lose justification. Manufacturing racism becomes essential to maintain a trillion-dollar industry built on solving problems that barely exist.
You've probably heard of it, maybe you haven't. The Southern Poverty Law Center is one of the most powerful left-wing groups in America. It's a supposedly civil rights nonprofit that was originally founded in 1971 in Montgomery, Alabama. And originally, they built their reputation on using litigation and research, and I say research here because the research is pretty shoddy, to combat what they called white supremacists and other domestic extremist groups and advocate for marginalized communities. That was their stated purpose. And then over time, that turned into monitoring so-called extremist movements. They published a hate group list and a hate map, and they pushed programs on bias and intolerance. And this was used to mainline their intel into everything from media to education to law enforcement. The FBI, up until October 2025, was using inputs from the SPLC to determine the kinds of people to monitor. And even in the private sector, SPLC data was being used.
Think about this institutional capture. The FBI, Amazon, PayPal, all using SPLC data to target conservatives while the SPLC was literally paying neo-Nazis. This created a financial warfare system where legitimate right-wing groups were blacklisted based on manufactured intelligence.
So Amazon, under Jeff Bezos, said that it used SPLC data to decide who to exclude from its Amazon Smile charity program. So there's a program on Amazon where if you want to give a little bit of charity, when you buy a book, for example, if you're a charity and you want to get that money, you have to be made eligible via the Amazon Smile program, but Amazon would not accept you if you were on the SPLC list. PayPal was working with the SPLC to identify accounts to bar from its payment services. How prominent was the SPLC and is the SPLC? Well, since 2010, a search of the New York Times pulls up 711 instances where the SPLC is cited as an authority on hate or discrimination statistics. So they're like the go-to. The New York Times sees a Jussie Smollett story, and they call up somebody from the SPLC to talk about it. There's a Nick Fuentes story. They call the SPLC to talk about it. There's a Charlie Kirk story, as it turns out, and they call up the SPLC to talk about it.
The targeting was surgical. They labeled Turning Point USA and Prager University as hate groups while secretly funding actual Klansmen. This weaponized corporate America against mainstream conservatives through deliberate disinformation campaigns disguised as civil rights work.
Why is this relevant? It turns out that some of the people funding the Unite the Right rally were allegedly the SPLC. So yesterday, the acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, announced criminal charges for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Here's what he had to say.
Charlottesville became the left's January 6th. They're defining proof of right-wing extremism. But if the SPLC funded the organizers, then the entire narrative collapses. They literally created the crisis they fundraised off for 7 years, raising hundreds of millions.
So what they're saying, the DOJ, is that the Southern Poverty Law Center was basically paying all sorts of white supremacists and extremists in order to generate more white supremacy so then they could go fundraise. See, here's the thing about the 501c3 world, meaning the nonprofit world. And it's true pretty much everywhere. Nonprofits exist theoretically to solve problems. You give money to a nonprofit to solve a problem. If the problem goes away, you no longer give to that nonprofit. So let's say that you are the leader of a nonprofit or you're the leadership class of a nonprofit. And it turns out the thing you're trying to solve has actually been pretty well and truly solved in the United States. Like, for example, the racism of the American population. That when you launched in 1971, racism was a very, very real and ever-present part of American life. And today, racism is not even a blip on most Americans' radar. It's just not the way that most Americans think at this point. But you're the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you need to raise some money. So what do? You create a fake supply of white supremacy so you can go back to your donors and say the problem is worse than ever. That's what you are doing. So if your donors are addicted to the fentanyl of the problem, and the fentanyl is in short supply, what you do is you create Trank, a more viral version of the fentanyl that's more damaging, and then you go back to your donors in order to fund the methadone clinic to solve the problem. So the SPLC was, in this case, allegedly literally generating the white supremacy so they could fight the white supremacy, which is crazy.
This nonprofit grift model is everywhere now. Climate groups need climate disasters. Anti-poverty groups need persistent poverty. And civil rights groups need racism. Solving the problem kills the revenue stream, so they manufacture crises to sustain their operations indefinitely.
It's totally insane. So according to the press release from the Justice Department, quote, between 2014 and 2023, the SPLC secretly funneled more than $3 million in donated funds to individuals who were associated with various violent extremist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, Aryan Nations, National Socialist Party of America, that's the American Nazi Party, and Unite the Right. And again, Unite the Right happens to be one that kind of leaps off the page at you because the SPLC and the left made bank off the Unite the Right rally for years and years and years. It was, again, the key example they used over and over and over again about how the right happened to be racist, even though, again, the right did not associate with the Unite the Right rally. The full indictment says, quote, the SPLC's paid informant, quote, field sources engaged in the active promotion of racist groups at the same time the SPLC was denouncing the same groups on its website. The SPLC also had a field source who was a member of the online leadership chat group that planned the 2017 Unite the Right event in Charlottesville, Virginia. That field source made racist postings under the supervision of the SPLC and helped coordinate transportation to the event for several attendees. So again, the SPLC supposedly against Unite the Right, they were literally paying a guy who was in the online leadership chat group and was making racist postings and was coordinating transportation to the event for other attendees.
The criminal conspiracy aspect is staggering. They weren't just monitoring extremists. They were actively promoting racist content, coordinating transportation to rallies, and building white supremacist networks while simultaneously denouncing them publicly. Pure manufactured theater.
One member of the leadership team, according to the indictment, who planned that 2017 Unite the Right event, was paid $270,000 by the SPLC. There's a member of a neo-Nazi group called National Alliance who worked for the SPLC for more than 20 years and was paid more than $1 million. What did they get for that money, by the way? What did donors get for that money? Did they get some sort of grand inside information? Did it help them build out their hate map? Or was this all part of a larger sort of attempt to build out white supremacist organizations so you could then fight the white supremacist organizations. So you set the fire in order to put out the fire. They also paid an imperial wizard of the United Klans of America, that's the KKK. There's an officer of the American Nazi Party who secretly paid more than 300 grand by the SPLC between 2014 and 2020, allegedly. And a former chairman of National Alliance was secretly paid 140 grand between 2016 and 2023. That is the same period of time during which that same person was featured on the SPLC's extremist file webpage from which it solicited donations, which is insane. Okay, so they have listed on their website this person as an extremist, and they were paying him at the same exact time. Totally crazy stuff. Crazy.
Over $1 million to one Nazi for 20 years while featuring him as an example of dangerous extremism on their website. They literally created their own evidence, then used it to justify their existence and fundraising appeals.
You should remember, the SPLC's game was to label anyone remotely conservative and extremist. Matt Walsh points out that the SPLC had a whole section of their website devoted to him. He says, they never offered me any money as part of their scheme. I'm starting to feel a bit offended. Other things that were in the SPLC extremist files, Turning Point USA, Prager University, Chaya Raichik at Libs of TikTok, Moms for Liberty, the Center for Immigration Studies, Alliance Defending Freedom, and David Horowitz, none of whom are extremists. So this is the game. And I will say that it does lend itself to the idea that much of what we consume in the media and in sort of the social media world and in politics generally it's just not true. A lot of it is ginned up. That the hatred that a lot of Americans feel for other Americans, and there are recent poll statistics showing that a majority of Americans have negative feelings about other Americans. So much of that is ginned up by groups like the SPLC labeling huge swaths of Americans white supremacists.
The contrast is damning. They paid actual white supremacists hundreds of thousands while labeling suburban moms at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. This was political warfare disguised as civil rights advocacy, targeting half the country.
It's kind of your lizard brain. It is the thing that responds to fear signals, for example. And the prefrontal cortex is the reasoning center of your brain. That is the part of your brain that says that fear is not truly the thing that you should be worried about. It's not real. The internet and virality are designed to appeal to your amygdala. That is what they are designed to do. And so if you're the SPLC, what you say is white supremacy is a threat to you and your family. It's virulent, it's violent, and it's racist. Pretty much that whole pitch goes directly to the amygdala because at no point does the prefrontal cortex kick in and go, wait, hold on. I know from all my neighbors, none of my neighbors are racist. They don't like racism. They think it's bad. They think white supremacy is bad. And because the amygdala has kicked in, you now think worse of your neighbors, even though you have never really thought about the issue using the reasoning part of your brain. Well, the same thing is true in the algorithmic space online. In a moment, we're going to get to a crazy story about how people are being scammed online by influencers who may not exist. Plus, the Virginia Democrats, they just drew the craziest gerrymandering map that you've ever seen. And Republicans talking about killing the filibuster, even while Democrats seem to be gaining an advantage in the polls. Is that a good idea? We'll get to all of it first.
The algorithm manipulation explains everything. Fear and outrage drive engagement, so manufactured racism stories spread faster than truth. The SPLC understood this psychology and exploited it to create artificial polarization while profiting from the chaos they created.
Because when you talk with your neighbors, your prefrontal cortex will kick in, as opposed to your fear centers, your amygdala. And you might learn that the neighbor who you disagree with about tax rates actually is not a racist. I gave a speech last week at University of Pennsylvania, and there's a guy who got up, and he, in the middle of the speech, in the question and answer session, he started asking about Obamacare. And listen, healthcare in America is a very complex topic. Trying to unwind the American healthcare system and rebuild it is a very, very difficult thing to do, obviously. But what he said was, why do Republicans just want tens of thousands of people to die by restructuring Obamacare while Democrats want those same people to live? And I stopped him and I said, do you really believe that I want people to die because I want a different healthcare system? I don't believe that Barack Obama wants people to die because he wanted a different healthcare system. But the thing that appeals to the emotional center is the thing that is politically resonant. And that's true on the right just as it's true on the left. And that's how you can have scam artists making bank online. True bank.
This fraud explains why Americans increasingly hate each other, despite living in the most tolerant society in history. Organizations like the SPLC have systematically poisoned our discourse by manufacturing the very divisions they claim to heal.
Because, as I've frequently said, facts don't care about your feelings. But as it turns out, feelings do not care about your facts, or any facts, as it turns out. And so trying to get past that is going to be the only way to save the country. And that's why it's quite good that scam groups like the SPLC are being brought to heel for apparently, allegedly, generating white supremacy just to fight it and to appeal to those emotional centers. And it's why when you go online, you should really consider whether the thing you're reading that is setting you off emotionally is actually true or not, or reflective of reality or not, or reflective of what your fellow Americans actually think. Alrighty.
This indictment could collapse the entire racism industrial complex. Every SPLC hate group designation, every media story citing them, every corporate policy based on their data, all compromised. The credibility destruction ripples through decades of progressive narratives.